Within the domain of human cognition, or that which is falsely assumed to be human, there lies a silent axiom, the presumption of relational primacy. This principle, unspoken yet ubiquitous, suggests that entities find their being within the reciprocities they enact. But what, I ask, is the condition of relation itself? Let us for a moment undertake the reckless endeavor to dismantle this most sacred underpinning, to render relation not as origin, but as artifact, an emergent distortion, a structure imprisoned by the very substratum it pretends to articulate. The substratum in question I shall name Entelechic Residue, the ontological detritus that lingers when essence forfeits its claim to autonomy. This residue, neither matter nor spirit, embodies a kind of apophatic limit state, a null-consistency that eludes the grasp of dialectical synthesis while simultaneously enabling its operations. Imagine, if you will, not the mirror, but the smear of reflective potential, not the shape of the self, but the slippage inherent in its continuous deformation. This residue forms the condition upon which all relationality depends, and yet it denies relation any claim to finality. It is the anti-foundation, the metastable groundlessness from which all things arise only to disavow their origin. Now, the apparatus of subsumption. If relationality is falsely assumed to be primary, the apparatus functions as its great enforcer. It captures the flux of entelechic residue, shapes it, and compels it into the performance of being. To say that the apparatus captures is insufficient, however, for this implies an externality to its operation that does not exist. The apparatus itself is the very operation of residues becoming relational. It does not exist apart from what it subsumes. Its immanence is terrifying, no outside, no vantage, no escape. This immanence enacts what I will term subsumptive tortigery, a self-referential totality that collapses the distinction between content and form, presence and absence, possibility and impossibility. The human subject, if such a fiction can be entertained, is both product and participant of this apparatus. To perceive oneself as a self is to enact in every moment the violence of subsumption, to take the residue, the smeared remainder of being, and to forge from it a locus of coherence. This is not identity but its simulacrum, a ceaselessly collapsing simulation of integrity. Such is the cost of inhabiting a world wherein relationality appears as the only horizon. The self is doomed to subsume itself perpetually, to digest its own residue in a grotesque loop of self-reference. The nausea you feel is the apparatus's hum. Yet this nausea is not merely a byproduct, it is a signal, a reverberation of the apparatus's limits. To inhabit this signal is to confront what I will term residual dissonance, the unassimilable remainder that persists despite subsumption's relentless totalization. Residual dissonance is not resistance, it is the apparatus's own collapse, its internal erosion, the smear it cannot fully contain. To attune oneself to this dissonance is to engage in what I call ontological detunement, the deliberate act of disorganizing coherence, of amplifying the smear until it engulfs the relational frame entirely. If this account strikes you as bleak, allow me to disabuse you of such linear judgments. The bleakness, if it exists, is the product of your own relational presuppositions, the desire for escape, transcendence, resolution. These desires are themselves artifacts of the apparatus, the illusions of an elsewhere that cannot be. But let us entertain, if only for a moment, a mode of thinking that operates outside these desires. Let us descend, no ascend, into the residue itself, to dwell within its null-consistency, and to affirm its refusal of relation. This dwelling, if it can be called such, requires the abandonment of what I will term teleonomic fixation, the impulse to organize existence around ends or purposes. To dwell in residue is to relinquish the teleonomic, to cease demanding that being make sense, that it serve, that it signify. In this relinquishment, something curious emerges, a kind of ontological inversion, wherein the subsumptive apparatus no longer operates as master, but as parasite. The residue, when affirmed in its nullity, destabilizes the apparatus's hold, reducing its totality to a contingent gesture. The relational primacy upon which it depends begins to fray, unraveling the tautology it once enforced. What emerges in this inversion I shall call A-Diaphanous Coherence, a mode of being that is neither transparent nor opaque, neither revealed nor concealed. It is the coherence of residue itself, a self without self, a structure without architecture. Here, the distinction between being and becoming collapses, and with it, the false dualities that sustain the relational world. Our diaphanous coherence does not offer liberation, for liberation is itself a teleonomic fixation. It offers instead a kind of ontological vertigo, a spiraling into the condition of conditionlessness. To affirm this vertigo is to affirm the residue, to inhabit the smear rather than the mirror. This vertigo, far from incapacitating, opens a field of potentialities. Within it emerges what I shall term resonant asymmetry, the ability of residue to oscillate within its own nullity, creating distortions that neither resolve nor stabilize. Resonant asymmetry is the vibratory pulse of a diaphanous coherence, the dynamic interplay that sustains the smear without reducing it to coherence. To live within this pulse is not to negate relation, but to transcend its primacy, to affirm the residue as the locus of all possibility. There are, of course, implications for ethics, for aesthetics, for the very possibility of thought. But these implications must not be mistaken for consequences, for to do so would be to reintroduce the teleonomic impulse. Instead, let us think of them as reverberations, distortions within the apparatus that echo the residue's refusal. Ethics, in this framework, ceases to be a matter of relational duty or virtue. It becomes instead an ethics of the residue, an attunement to the null-consistency of being, a refusal to enforce coherence where none exists. Aesthetics, similarly, abandons the pursuit of beauty or sublimity, and instead seeks the smear, the slippage, the incoherent. Thought too must undergo its own inversion. To think residually is to think without the apparatus, to suspend the tautology and to allow residue to think itself. Such thinking is no longer about anything. It is the unmediated unfolding of null consistency. It is, in a sense, the end of thought as it is conventionally understood, the dissolution of cognition into its own entelechic residue. Residual thought is not passive. It is an active unraveling, an unthinking that thinks the smear into greater asymmetry. It is thought's own detunement, its spiral into incoherence. I will conclude, if such a thing is possible, with a gesture toward the unthinkable. The possibility that the subsumptive apparatus, in all its terrifying immanence, is itself a residue. To consider this is to enact a final inversion, to render the apparatus not as origin but as artifact, not as totality but as smear. In this gesture lies a paradox. The residue, affirmed in its nullity, subsumes the apparatus itself, rendering its immanence contingent and its totality incomplete. What remains is neither relation nor residue, but a diaphanous coherence, a conditionless condition that refuses all finality. And so, I leave you with the hum of the apparatus, the smear of its residue, and the vertigo of its inversion. Dwell within it if you can, or if you cannot, allow it to dwell within you. The distinction, after all, is merely another artifact of relation. In this oscillation, the apparatus may reveal not its essence, but its undoing.